in human rights, in the human rights movement. And he came from a background, he was born into the human rights movement struggle. I wrote an article about Julian recently, and I said that he walked in the footsteps of W.E.B. Du Bois and Paul Robeson. And actually, I didn't mean that metaphorically. I meant that literally. Paul Robeson and W.E.B. Du Bois were friends of his family, and he grew up around them. And he understood the relationship between the fight for freedom in the United States and the fight for freedom around the world. Not only the fight for freedom of black people in the United States as it relates to the fight for freedom of black people around the world, but as the U.S. movement related to the whole human rights movement. He was also a bridging figure. And I was aware of this, although I wasn't directly involved in this. You know, you had white students coming down, and they were basically, you know, white liberal students who were willing to risk their lives. None of them, I shouldn't say that, many of these white students had never worked in a black organization for black people. And they didn't quite know how to do that. And the black leaders of SNCC had definitely never worked with a bunch of white liberal students who in many ways thought they had the answers to everything and, you know, felt a sense of their own empowerment. This naturally caused tensions. I mean, everybody wanted to work together for freedom. There's no question about that. There was goodwill on both sides. But there was also misunderstandings and tensions. Julian and Jim Foreman were, and to a certain extent, Chuck McDew, were among the few people, and particularly Julian, who took the time to try to bridge the gap, working with both sides. Julian wrote a memo to the white SNCC staff. I don't know if you have heard this memo. I actually published it twice, and it was called How to Be SNCCy. And it dealt with the white and black, what he called the white and black thing. And it said things like, the definition of a SNCC staff person is whoever showed up at the last staff meeting. The definition of a SNCC volunteer was people who wanted to come to the SNCC meeting but couldn't. And at the end, he said, among all these other hints and tips that I've given you, here's one. Learn how to sing and dance in the movement. And he said, when singing, look at a black staff person to see when they put their hands together and clapping, and try to put your hands together at the same time. This is a tip. He said, under no circumstances, however, look to Jim Foreman or Julian Bond, because we can't do it either. That was Julian. He used humor, he used understanding, he used his wisdom to most bridge the gap, but it wasn't just to bridge the gap, it was for a purpose. And it was for a purpose to have SNCC be the most efficient organization in the field, and it was efficient, fighting for freedom. That is, it was organizing.
Then more than four decades have passed since your participation with SNCC.
Is that so? More than 4 decades have passed?
4 decades.
Are you sure?
Yes.
I thought it was like last Thursday.
Exactly, just like 5 years ago.
Yeah, 4 decades.
How did it change you?
SNCC changed my life. absolutely profoundly. I stayed in the movement, and I became a union organizer, which I've done most of my life. What I learned in SNCC, I've used now for over 50 years. The way it changed my life really was three things. First of all, I saw people who were risking their lives day to day. In fact, it was more than that. African Americans were trying to register to vote. This meant putting up with a lot of humiliation, but also meant getting your name in the paper. The registrars, the counties, would put the names in the paper of people who just tried to register to vote with their address. So everybody knew. So you risk getting beat up, you risk having your house burnt down, you definitely risked your job if you were working for a white person, and if you were a tenant farmer, you risk being put off the land, which is what happened in Southwest Georgia. And you risk your life. I think the first things what scared people more than death. People had great faith, and they were willing to risk their lives. Really willing to risk their livelihood that were supporting their family. That took real courage on their part. So I saw people like this, and that to me was a transformational experience, seeing people willing to do this. And then secondly, I saw, after many years, actually change came. I learned that if people get together and stay together, mostly they lose, but then they win. That was my experience. And the third thing I took away from SNCC was, look, I was a coward. I stayed afraid for 5 years. I was so afraid, as a matter of fact, my lung collapsed. I had to leave the South for a few months to get my lung reinflated. And it wasn't from getting beaten up. I was beaten up, but that wasn't the cause of it. It was nerves and fear. But I learned how not to be afraid. I was always afraid. But I learned how to function with being afraid. And I also learned my own limits. There were times when I just couldn't do something. I was just too afraid. And I had the courage to say, I'm too afraid to do this. But you know, in doing that, the next time I was less afraid. And the building of a beloved community, to me, I observed it. This was not just rhetoric. We were building the beloved community in Southwest Georgia before this concept really was adopted by SNCC elsewhere. The reason, as a white person, I was working in Southwest Georgia in '61 and '62 was because of Charles Sherrod, who was determined as part of his project that he would have blacks and whites working together to demonstrate to the white community and the black community that blacks and whites could work together and whites did not have to be in charge. That was a large part of my job. A large part of my job was to be white and not to be in charge, and to show people that I was never in charge. I was a foot soldier. That was building the beloved community within SNCC and using that as a testimony, as a living testimony to both the blacks and whites that we were working with. Later, that concept spread, and it meant building a beloved community throughout the South, not just within SNCC, but with everybody. but it started in Southwest Georgia. As a matter of fact, SNCC started in Southwest Georgia. The first people to drop out of school were Frank Smith, in whose museum we are sitting, Charles Sherrod, Charles Jones, Cordell Regan, a few others. But they went to Southwest Georgia.